I'm absolutely passionate about this journal. The whole idea of the journal, I think the origin of it was Andy Kendrick, the first editor's idea. And it came out of the Skinner report developments. It's really about the professionalisation of the child and youth care workforce in Scotland. And Andy had the idea that we should have a journal which would be dedicated to residential or group care in Scotland. And I think initially the idea was that we would encourage authors within Scotland, but very quickly we realised that it was important to have an international outlook. So it was. So I think the idea of the journal was both about celebrating good practice and bringing to the attention of child and youth care workers in Scotland good practice, innovative practice, research ideas from within the country, but also encouraging authors from outside the country, so that we could have an outlook, and that we would celebrate the profession within Scotland, but also develop ideas for articles that would come from other countries. So we had a sense of what was happening internationally in child and youth care.
Well, my name's Andy Kendrick. I was the first professor of residential childcare when the Scottish Institute of Residential Childcare was set up in around about 2000. And I think in my role as professor, I wanted to ensure that we used all the avenues open to get to communicate with residential childcare workers, but also with wider people in the field. And I felt that a journal would be an important way to do this. It was difficult in a sense to set up. We went for a print journal back then, but it felt very much like flying by the seat of your pants at the start in terms of getting contributions in. We were clear that we wanted to get a wide range of people contributing to the journal, so residential workers, other professionals, care experienced young people were possible, as well as contributions which were setting out the latest research and practice innovations going on at that time.
Andy Kendrick approached me and asked me if I'd be the book review editor like a lot of years ago, maybe 2005 or 6. And I love books, so that seemed like a great thing to do. And I really did enjoy doing that. It's a hard job because people want to do it, but the time it takes to really read the book and then write the review, for some people, it ends up being more than they bargained for. So chasing those up was a part of my early experiences. And I sat on the editorial board, and that was always a really enjoyable kind of creative group of people. And then when Andy kind of had to step away from the editorial role because of other demands on his time, I don't think I've ever told anybody this. I approached both Andy and Graham, kind of asking them, like, would it be okay if I kind of stepped into that role or helped out, or because I didn't want to be presumptuous, and I thought, I didn't know if they would be like, no, please no. And they were both lovely, and they were both like, oh yes, please. And so that was, I almost didn't do it, and I wasn't sure I had the time for it because it is a very time consuming thing, but I also wasn't sure that that would be welcome, but then I could put them on the spot to have to like figure out what to say, because they're both I've had the kind of relationships with them that they wouldn't want to say something to hurt my feelings, but fortunately that worked out well. I don't remember for how long. It in some respects it feels like a really long time because it is a lot of work, and in other respects it felt like just a flash, you know, in a timeline. And so I then edited with Graham for a few years, and have continued to sit on the editorial board since then. So yeah, because that's a nutshell of my relationship with the journal.
So I'm Leanne McIver and I'm the book review editor for the journal. And I was invited probably 4 years ago to take on that role. And I was really interested in it because I'm somebody who has always loved books. And in the past, I did English at university alongside the psychology that I did. And so it felt like a really nice opportunity to, alongside the research, which is the kind of substantive part of my work, to start getting involved in helping people write book reviews and identify books to be reviewed, and trying to make sure that every issue of the journal has at least a couple of book reviews in that are going to be of interest to the journal's readership.
Yeah, my name's Dan Johnson. I'm a forensic psychologist. I'm also clinical director at Kibble. My connection with the journal is I'm currently on the editorial board, but I've also submitted a few papers and obviously been reading it for years.
Yeah, my name's Joe. I worked in residential childcare for 19 years, starting off as a sessional worker. I've worked in various places, including the different kind of provisions, and then eventually ended up as a manager in a local authority at the very end. And then I have now moved into lecturing, so I'm now a lecturer in further education at Glasgow College. In terms of my connection with the journal, from the very beginnings of my time working in residential, I've always been aware of the journal, and it really took prominence when I took up the HNC in residential care, and that was through Langside College at the time in CERC. And a lot of the materials that were pretty much presented to us in terms of HNC students were connected to the journal. So that was really quite a prominent link. And then in addition to that, I eventually done the Masters in Residential Care, and the journal was a big part of the teaching on the Masters, alongside the core reader at that time, which was a book called Rethinking Residential Childcare by Mark Smith. So got really kind of a strong connection with the journal for the very beginning of my time working in residential.
Talking about the editorial board, you are the editor, Graham. Can you tell us a wee bit about your time as editor?
Well, I should start by acknowledging that I'm part of an editorial team. I'm chairing an editorial team, of which you're a very important part yourself, Sarah. Well, I became the editor in 2012, and at that time it was a hard copy journal. It was paid for by subscription, institutional subscriptions, mainly university libraries, and individual subscriptions. That was a very resource-intensive process, if you can imagine, getting it printed and so on, and getting it out to people. And it already seemed in 2012 that was old-fashioned. And so I suppose if I can lay any claim to innovation here, it was with a great deal of help to get this journal online. And of course, for our readers who are having a look, they'll wonder why we didn't publish in 2012, and that was simply because we used that year to do all the back office work in getting this journal online, which was clearly the way people were beginning to read journals anyway, and also it was certainly important to me that there should be no barriers to access. And having to have a subscription and therefore to know about it and so on was clearly a barrier. And removing that barrier, I think, I'm pretty sure that was the tipping point, because in truth we had very few individual subscribers, like quite a lot of institutional subscribers, all the university libraries in Scotland and one or two elsewhere, but. We didn't have a large number of individual subscribers. So the aim was to make it more widely available, free to download, with no barriers. And I think we achieved that.
As a member of the editorial board, can you tell us what's that like? What's required of you?
I suppose there's two main roles. One is to shape how the journal's evolving, what direction we're going in, what we want the journal to be. And also the best bit is you get to read people's papers and learn from them and hopefully try and improve them where we can.
Well, when I get the opportunity to sit in the editorial board, it's a real kind of privilege, I have to say. And you know, that whole notion of being able to scrutinise articles that's going to be presented in the journal is something I don't take lightly. So I was delighted to get that opportunity, and also just I take it very seriously in terms of that audit process, quality assurance process, to make sure that the quality is good enough for people to read and use in practice as well. It's got to be accessible for me as well, so that people at all levels in their journey can read the articles and make use of them. So that's a key part of it for me.
As the book review editor, can you tell us about some of the favourite books that you've read over your time?
To be honest, I mainly read the reviews rather than the books themselves. There's actually been very few of the books that have been reviewed that I have personally read. Although one of the great things about the role is that people keep flagging books that I think, oh, I want to read that now. Even if it's something I've never heard of, or, you know, something, not being a practitioner, quite a lot of them are practitioner focused, but I sometimes feel, oh yeah, I would quite like to read that. So I've got this kind of a real stack of books waiting to be read, but also my kind of imaginary stack of books for when I come back to looking at ones that people have reviewed for the journal. But it's one of the best things about the role, that you just get to hear what other people are reading and what they thought of it. And especially when you hear from people that are using these books in their professional lives. I think for me to get a good understanding of what's out there and how people are actually really reading stuff and actually putting it into practice, what their own thoughts and reflections are, I just find that fascinating and really, really good to be able to share that with the journal readers.
I think the significance of the journal is it's about identity. It's a journal that's specifically about residential childcare. All the articles are written through that lens. In addition to that, there's not just a British audience or a Scottish audience, but there's an international audience and readership attached to the journal. And in addition to that, the contributors are also international. So you've got a lot of people from different countries: South Africa, North America, the UK, Ireland, you name it. There's somebody's contributed to that journal from a particular country, and they usually get something unique to say about this complex field that they work in.
Well, we've never made claims to be a high status research journal, although we've had high quality research articles in the journal. We're not part of a publishing house. We're published by CELCIS as part of its Scottish Institute of Residential Childcare offer to the profession. We're explicitly free to download, and that's been an important part of the values of the journal, so that there are no barriers to access the journal for professionals working in the sector, or indeed for young people or anyone who wants to access the articles that we have to offer. So I think it sits rather curiously. It's unusual, I think, and you've got to give credit to CELCIS, our parent organisation, for putting in the resource to get this online and make it free to download. Where does it sit internationally in terms of status as a journal? Well, that's for others to judge, I think, but we're proud of it. And going by the downloads that we have, it clearly serves a purpose. Obviously, most downloads are in the United Kingdom and other English-speaking countries. But every year we're surprised when we see where we're actually being read. And of course, we've tried very hard to have our advocates in different countries by having an international editorial board, so that we have people who can be champions of the journal in their own countries.
I think it's got a pretty unique place, and this is the real strength, I think. I can't think of any other journal like it. It's both really, really niche, really specific, but somehow it's got this really full breadth in the same way. So yes, it's all about residential care, it's all about young people, but it's international. And it's everything within residential care that can range from, you know, attachment to systems, to theory, to practitioner reflection. So, you know, it's there's nothing quite like it.
But I think it's huge, having set it up and remembering the work that was needed around that time in terms of setting it up. I think the journal's gone from strength to strength. I think it was a huge step for it to go online, simply because that increases the accessibility of the journal, and the fact that you can go back. Just at the start, I went back to look at what was in the very first journal issue, and I'm thinking, yeah, that's still good. It's still relevant in terms of the residential sector today. And I think the other important aspect has been that we set out for it to have a wide range of people contributing to the journal, and I think that's happened over the years. Residential staff and professional staff are regular contributors, which is great, showing flagging up issues, but also putting forward innovative solutions in terms of the residential sector. Care experience, young people have contributed in a whole range of different ways. And I think one mark of the success of the journal is now the range of international contributions we get, because although it's, and I know I've had this debate with Graham, it's still the Scottish Journal of Residential Childcare, which marks, in a sense, I think, this is where it started, this is where it was created, with a very specific purpose to speak to the residential sector in Scotland. Nevertheless, it now has an international reputation and is and gets contributions from international academics and professionals, but also is speaking to the world.
I want to say how proud I am of the journal. And like I said, I was only editor for a little flash of the time, but anytime I'm like reading and it gets cited a lot, and a lot for a little mom and pop journal. Like I sit on the editorial board for a Taylor and Francis journal, which is like corporate level academic publication, and it's a totally different ballgame. That's a labor of love too, but in a very different way. This really takes a lot more blood, sweat, and tears to make this happen. It is hosted by CELCIS, but like I recognize what you and Graham are doing, and so whenever I see articles cited, and they're cited quite regularly in the stuff that I'm reading for my teaching or for the research I'm doing or other scholarship work, like I always just have this big flurry of pride about that. And I do see that often. I do see students responding to articles that we encourage them to read, or I even require some reading for sessions, and how they respond to articles from the journal as well.
Hi there, I'm Craig McCready. I am a consultant with the Improving Care Experiences Hub.
I'm Gemma Watson, and I'm also a consultant within the Improving Care Experiences Hub at CELCIS.
I think to try to characterise what my connection is to the journal, it very much started at the beginning of this year, 2022, when our comms colleagues wanted to kind of celebrate the fact that the journal was moving into its 20th year. And they wanted to be able to kind of elevate and celebrate and promote content from over the 20 years and connect some of the article content to moments across the year. So could there be articles that we promote in relation to Foster Care Fortnight or National Care Experience Week, etc. So Gem and I were given the opportunity to start to look for content against these moments. And as I started to get into the process, I actually wondered if this might be a moment that would allow us to do a bit of a broader, deeper dive and to try to understand what all of the rich content was that sat within the archive. So I just started at the beginning in 2002, and I read the first article and I tried to figure out what theme I thought it was primarily talking about. And then I read the next one, and I read the next one, and I read the next one, and I started to try to figure out, could we start to group the articles together under the themes as the themes emerged through the exploration. And after about a week or so, I spoke to Gemma about what I was doing and how I'd been spending some of my time over the past week, and she rightly pointed out the enormous mistake I had made, because it was going to take me forever. But Gemma, being Gemma, wanted to be part of the solution and offered to do it with me. So I absolutely said yes and took her up on that. So we agreed at that point that I would continue where I was, having started in 2002, and that Gemma would start looking at the second 10 years and start reading articles from 2012.
Yeah, so Craig and I, as Craig said, took 10 years each and worked through them. And at points, I suppose, we became slightly snowblind, we called it, when we were reading the articles, because we had read so many articles in such a short space of time that there were challenges at points in theming them. Some articles, it wasn't obvious right away what the theme was. So we allowed some of the articles just to sit and percolate for a few days until Craig and I could come together and read them together and think about what the theme might be. And sometimes Craig would read my article and say, Gemma, of course, that's staffing issues or practice, because reading it being a bit further away from it, it's more obvious. Also, we had concerns at some points that there were too many themes. As we were adding articles, the themes were growing over time, and we wondered if we should try and distill them down or just let them sit. And one of the examples is participation versus young people's perspectives. So some of the articles spoke directly to participation, where some spoke about young people's perspectives on their own care journey or their own care records. So we allowed them to sit as separate themes. And also ACEs and trauma was another one that we thought, did we distill this into one theme? But when we revisited it, we actually came to realise that when we were talking about ACEs in the articles, it was talking explicitly about young people's trauma, children and young people's trauma. And when we were looking at the trauma theme, that also included the wellbeing and the vicarious trauma of staff.
So it's the journal's 20th birthday. Looking back, is there any key moments over the past 20 years that you think have influenced the shape or the direction of the journal?
Irene Stevens, I remember her leadership, and so I must have been sitting on the board when she was, and I think she was the first person to start to think about, yes, it's possible to go for peer review. And I don't remember when peer review happened, if it happened under her leadership or she just helped us get to a place where we could see that being possible. And having that peer review element, I think, was a big changing thing. Going completely online gave us more breathing room for more articles and more types of articles. And I think that was important. I do like having something tangible in my hand when I'm reading, but I think the benefits of online outweigh the loss of that. I think the love issue was a big deal. I think already in the field, there was people talking about the place of love and that there may be, and there is in certain cases, a place for love in professional practice. And I say in certain cases, because at that time it was a bit taboo. And it felt vulnerable, like putting our head above that parapet. And there had even been some articles in the CERC journal addressing that, but to have a whole dedicated issue was a big deal. So I guess those are the three things that come to mind for me.
Well, within Scotland, you would have to point to the independent care review, now universally known as the Promise, because Scottish Government promised to current young people and care experienced young people and adults that there would be that they had listened and that they would make improvements and so on. And virtually all the articles now that emanate from Scotland refer to the Promise. That's their context. I suppose internationally, of course, we'd have to point to the pandemic, which is still influencing the lives of young people and their families around the world. Of course, we had a series of special articles in 2020, and one wonders just the ongoing influence of that pandemic, and I'd love to see more articles, particularly from the African countries and the Indian subcontinent. We published a number, but I'd like to see more. I'd like to know, for example, the impact on young people of the vaccines. And then the war in Ukraine, which has led to family migration on a scale that honestly we thought we'd left behind after the Second World War. And I imagine we will have articles based on those experiences in the future in the journal.
One of the first articles that was published in the journal is one that I always remember, and that was by Leslie Archer, and it was called "What Works in Residential Care." And it was really a kind of her, I suppose, summary of a number of pieces of literature kind of brought together, and some of her own work to make sense of what components you need to provide good care. And that article for me is one that I still go to this day, and one that I recommend to people to go and read, because it really makes you see, how challenging the role can be, how some of the factors that influence our role are sometimes not within our control, and what you need to do to try and minimise trauma in the residential setting. So I think that was one for me. And the other one that I kind of remember was an article by Chris Walter, who was a manager at Camp Hill Communities at that point in time. And that was the story of Matthew. And it was looking at a case study, a real life study, on a particular young person that Chris had looked after, and using an ecological perspective to analyse what was going on for Matthew. And for that, again, for me, that was really interesting at the time, because I was doing the Masters in Residential Care. One of the assignments was on assessment, and it really brought to life that whole notion of ecological assessment and how it fits in with, for example, the national practice model in Scotland. And again, that's another article that I still kind of go back to and reread from time to time. And then finally, another article that I really kind of remember, also it's quite kind of significant to myself, is an article that I'd written alongside Debbie Nolan, and that was about reducing police involvement for children who are in care. And I kind of contributed to that piece of work as a kind of a guest perspective, if you like, being a guest in terms of writing that from a practitioner point of view. And for me, again, that was really a privilege in the first instance, but also quite a kind of important article, because it then kind of touched or aligned itself with the whole aspect of physical restraint and restraint reduction, and considering that through a broader lens. So that's the kind of ones for me. There's quite a few. I can talk all day about it, to be honest with you, but they're the ones that are really kind of stick out for me.
The level of stuff that we noticed was just vast, and Jem and I reflected the other day that we really wished we'd recorded our conversations, because we had hours and hours worth of conversations about this as we went through it, and we're kind of supporting each other with it. So some of the things that kind of come to mind, I guess, more readily are the fact that there are a greater number of issues and articles later on than there were earlier. So that left Gemma with more work to do than I did, because I did the first 10 years. We also, when we got to the end and we could see how many there were under each grouping, the top three, number one was articles that related to staffing issues, which included practice, recruitment, development. But it was number one by quite some way. The second, number two on the list was articles that related to international perspectives, so care settings in other countries around the world. And number three was articles that related to transitions and leaving care, which, given the kind of context and some of the conversation that's going on nationally just now, continues to be really interesting. So at the other end of the scale, some of the things that we noticed that we had a process of identifying every article with a primary, secondary, and where relevant, a tertiary theme. And one of the things that we noticed was that Girfect, for example, is mentioned twice as a secondary theme, but never as a primary one. And another similar one was that we noticed that social work training is identified once as a secondary theme, and all of that all of that writing. It just appears once.
Yeah, and some of the, I suppose I had the most recent articles from 2012, and something that I noticed was that we didn't start speaking about love in the sector explicitly until around 2016, around the same time as the Independent Care Review was announced. However, we were talking about love before that in the journal articles. We just didn't call it love. We were framing it as something different, but talking about love. And the other really interesting thing that I picked up was around the pandemic, that a lot of the articles that I themed during 2020 and 2021 spoke about how staff were changing practice to ensure that children and young people were being cared for in residential care around the pandemic, and how that the changes were made. And it's a record that we'll have forevermore. And I think it's really lovely that we've got a snapshot in time in the journal during that time that reflects how practice changed.
I think there have been a number of things. I think you've got to remember that back in 2002, when we put out the first issue, it was coming on the back of the 1990s. There'd been the Skinner Review of Residential Childcare. There'd been the Kent Children's Safeguards Reviews. There were these concerns about standards in residential childcare, and more broadly in terms of looked after children. The Scottish Institute for Residential Childcare was set up on the back of Kent. Marroll was set up on the back of the Kent Children's Safeguards Reviews. There were all these changes coming in, the Care Commission, the Scottish Social Services Council, the impact of the requirements for qualifications and registration for residential workers. So there was a huge amount of change, and I think the journal at that point was important in terms of flagging up this change for Scotland. I think since then there have been a number of issues which have been important, the Independent Care Review and the Promise. I think that, I think just some of the general developments in terms of both residential childcare and the wider childcare sector have needed to be addressed by the journal, but that those have been the things going on in Scotland, but that generally I think there's been a shift in terms of acknowledging the importance of relationships, acknowledging the importance of love in residential childcare and childcare more generally, which impact not just here, but in the residential sectors around the world.
Can you tell us a bit about how the journal supports new writers and aspiring authors?
Sure. That was always something I was really interested in, and I continue to be really interested in the role of writing in helping us to think more clearly or get in touch with our own knowledge as well as the knowledge of other people through and the relationship of reading and writing. And so I really wanted the journal to kind of have a dynamic presence in supporting inexperienced writers, especially people who are in direct practice in residential childcare. So we did start to do more with that. I think that's a lot of work, and that's hard to do too. And it's hard for inexperienced writers to take that kind of risk and do that. But the journal does regularly have pieces that are written by people supported to do that for the first time or the first few times sometimes. And I think that's a really valuable thing that helps the development of individuals in the residential childcare sector as well as the sector overall.
It's true to say that we've grown up as a journal. We've developed, we've obviously benefited from the experience of other journals. We've developed into a more, I think we've had a a formation as a journal to make it more professional. We've developed a reviewing process to make it more robust. But we've always encouraged new authors, and we've tried hard also to get young people to write, and we've been successful on a number of occasions to get young people to write, often along with workers. And so what we've tried to do is we've tried to have a supportive reviewing process, I think, is one aspect. And the other is that we will always have this offer that we will provide a member of our reviewing panel or our wider editorial group to support new authors.
If somebody was thinking about writing an article for the journal, what advice would you give them?
Good question. So be really interested and passionate about what you're writing about. That's always a good start. Think about your audience of people actually working in residential care, people who are practitioning, who are trying to make that environment better. So try and have real resonance for them. And don't be shy to share your own sort of reflections within that, your own experience, because that's what practitioners can thrive on sometimes.
So if somebody was interested in reviewing a book for the journal, what would the process be?
The very first thing is just to get in touch with us. We accept reviews that are likely to be of interest to our readership. It's very broad. It doesn't have to be an academic text. It can be somebody's autobiography or a biography of somebody, if perhaps their care experience or the author's care experience. So that would be of interest to our readership. It doesn't have to just be academic. It doesn't have to be specifically about residential childcare. We're very happy to have a chat by email and give people advice, support them as much as they need with the writing of the review. But we're happy to hear from anybody. If anyone has read something that they think, oh, that would be of interest to the readership of the journal, absolutely get in touch. We'd love to hear from you.
Looking to the future, where do you see the journal going next?
Well, I think we'd like to reach more countries, so we'll try very hard to expand our reach. I'd love to encourage more young people to write for the journal. I know that we've had poetry in the journal, and Jim Anglin has been encouraging us to have more poetry. And I'll tell you an interesting thing. Several people have emailed me recently to say how useful they find the book review section. And there was a time when I wondered if anyone ever read the book reviews, but it seems they do. So I'd love for that area to be developed.
Well, of course, I'm retired now, and I'm less involved in it. I'm very much looking at it from the outside. But I think if it can continue to have this broad range of contributions, speaking to the range of professionals, residential staff, and to care experienced young people themselves, drawing in the most recent research and ensuring that there is a real evidence base and research base for the development of the residential childcare sector and its role in the broader continuum of care services. I think it has, it has created a voice, an international voice now, and I think it can continue to do that.
I think what we've part of the narrative of where it might go leans on where it's come from, and we have seen continual involvement. What we see is this has never stood still. We have, one of the things Jen and I reflected on a lot was the language evolved constantly. There was language that appears in the first 2 or 3 years worth of content that isn't used now. We've kind of left it there, and we talk about things in a different way. There's different perspectives. So I take a lot of confidence in the fact that that's the backstory, and I think it points to a really, really healthy future direction.
And for me, I think we noticed that when we talk about practice, we didn't always talk about practice only in residential childcare. So it's a resource that I suppose other sectors and other professions can also dip into.
Well, I think the journal still needs to remain true to its roots, and still provide that kind of real it's a niche area, but there's quite a broad view within the journal. I think that needs to remain, in terms of different kind of national contexts. Looking at some of the key areas, some of the stuff that might not be easy to look at either. Stuff like physical restraint, for example. Stuff like the challenges of placement and the challenges of how the sector is used, and asking people who've got something interesting to say, and putting a challenge in place to try and kind of get people thinking. I think that's where we still need to be heading, and make it something that's kind of quite sits sometimes on the edge, but in a professional way.
I think the journal's in a wonderful position. It's got an international author group of authors. It's got an international audience. It's got folk who are really interested and passionate. I suppose it's just about building that and building on the subjects and the articles that we've already written. So there's some really fantastic articles that can really influence and improve practice. And let's just keep going on that. Let's develop that. And one thing that I'm really interested in is how technology can help us augment and improve care, like care's behind the rest of the world in some way, residential care. And so I'd love to see articles about that and the journal supporting that.
I think it's already got a very important place in the kind of, particularly in the Scottish context, but also increasingly in the international context. And I just think I think more attention to the journal as people start to realise. There's always a lot of debate about residential childcare in particular, but Scotland itself is going through a huge period of change, with the incorporation of UNCRC and with, the intention to keep the promise. And I actually think that the journal has probably got a really important place within that. And I think just going into the future, it's going to be good to see that being more recognised and understood in the community, even more so than it is now.
Looking forward, let me link that to looking forward, that we continue to produce content that helps individuals, teams, services, and the residential childcare sectors across the world continue to develop so that we're equal to the task of caring for children and young people many of whom have had the most adversities, so that they have better life chances and better experiences of care.
It's just lovely to see it going on from strength to strength. And I think that when I set it up, I took a lot of I did a lot of the work myself. I think it's much better structured now. It means it means that a broader range of people are involved in getting the journal up and running. But it just feels, what felt like my baby at that time has grown now and has reached adulthood. At this time, at reaching 20 years.
Well, I'd just like to say from a personal point of view, what an absolute pleasure it has been to edit this journal. And well, of course, I'm in retirement, and it's just such a wonderful way for me to keep connections with the sector in Scotland, elsewhere in the UK, and internationally. So it's just a delight to be involved with the journal.